try to keep your camera off and your mic muted. That way we are limiting some distractions. And with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Feel free to interrupt me if you have any questions at all. All right, so this program has been developed to really target our youth. So as an ag agent, I have noticed that we have a lot of youth who show dairy goats who don't participate in 4-H, and we have a lot of youth who participate in 4-H who would possibly benefit from a dairy goat project. So that is where this multi-session program derived from. So today I'm going to be going over some of the very basics on performance programs. Our last session focused on why 4-H could benefit your child and how to get a club started or how to join a club in your county. If you want information on that program, feel free to reach out, and it is available on my YouTube channel. There are 4 options to monitor your herd progress. So this is assuming that you have gone out and you have purchased a doe, maybe a few does, and maybe you already have a buck and you're getting your herd going, but you want to make sure that your herd is moving in a positive direction. And so in my opinion, there are 4 ways that you can do this, with the first being showing, the second being linear appraisal, the third participating in DHI, which is more commonly known as milk testing, and of course your own personal satisfaction. So just to get some information on our audience, if you participate or have participated in a dairy goat show, can you select the raise your hand button on your screen, just so I can see? I see Matthew 4, I see CJ, Bailey, Claire. Oh wow, so we have some people who have participated there. Okay, so what about how many of you have participated in linear appraisal? Uh-oh. Okay, so our number is a little bit smaller. And what about, hold on, I have to let some more people in our meeting. What about milk testing? Who here participates in DHI?
Excuse me.
Does somebody have a question?
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay,
we're looking for the raise your hand button.
Okay, so in the middle of your screen, there should be a little bar, and it should have a little hand that can come up. Or it's like the outline of a hand. Do you see it?
No, we have, we don't have that, no.
How strange. I wonder why.
I don't know. It's an iPad.
I'm working on a Mac and I don't have one either. So maybe it's
that may be why.
Platform issue.
All right. Thank you.
All right. So as you can see, that showing is possibly the more popular option. And then as we move into linear appraisal and DHI, the numbers get a little bit smaller. And that's probably because linear appraisal and milk testing, the paperwork alone is daunting and it's hard to get it figured out. So hopefully through this program, you'll have a couple questions answered, and maybe you'll even hook up with a mentor that can walk you through the process, because I know that is absolutely valuable. So first we're going to talk about showing. So if you've never shown your dairy goat, the point, of course, aside from hanging out with other dairy goat nerds, is to allow your goat to earn her legs. So that's what we call like a champion title for your breed. So she can earn 1 restricted leg, so she can be a champion once as a junior. And then if she achieves that, she can accomplish that twice as a freshened doe, as a senior doe. And if she doesn't get her leg as a junior, she can go on and earn all 3 legs as a senior. Once she has earned all 3, she's considered finished. So something that you may consider is, unless you're showing your doe in a champion challenge, typically once a doe has finished, we set them out of shows. So once she's finished, she's kind of checked that box and you can show her prodigy. So does anyone have any questions about that?
we had this situation in a show this past weekend. And if you have a doe that is a Finnish champion that wins grand, the reserve can get I think it's a restricted leg.
It's a restricted leg unless it's more than 20 does in milk, but yes.
Yeah.
Awesome. So there's lots of little tricky rules to things like that too. How do I get back to my screen? But the joy of showing, though winning is awesome, is getting to go out and actually have time to interact with other folks who show their goats. And some people aren't, like, you take your goat to the show, how do you prepare her? Of course, you're gonna wanna bathe her, make sure her feet are in great condition. Most people wear show whites, at least a white shirt. You wanna make sure you clip your doe. I found this chart. I can't remember where I saved it to my phone from, but it was on Facebook somewhere. And I thought that, I don't know who made it. And if y'all do, please tell me, because I'd love to give them credit. But this is an excellent demonstration of how you'd clip your doe. And if you've never clipped a goat or any animal with clippers before, find someone to help you. Every county has a county extension agent, so feel free to call yours, and they might not know exactly how to clip a goat, but I guarantee they've clipped something in their lives, so they should be able to help you out. So one of the cool things, so I came from a market livestock background. My family raised cattle, and so I showed cattle and market animals. So moving over to the dairy goat world, it's so neat to be able to take your goat somewhere and you can show her multiple times because they have multiple rings. So for example, the show coming up in Crowley, Louisiana, there's 2 rings on Saturday and 2 rings on Sunday. So if I take a doe, I'm gonna get to show her 4 times, which is just awesome, as opposed to spending your whole Saturday and only getting to walk in the show ring for 10 minutes, like we do at some market shows. So now we're gonna talk about linear appraisal. Linear appraisal it's essentially where an appraiser comes to you and they are going to use a linear scale to assign a quality number to your doe. We do have a linear appraiser on this call with us, so Jen, feel free to jump in at any moment because I know you know 10 times more about this than I do. But essentially they come to you or your host herd. They're going to evaluate your goat based on 13 linear traits. There has been an heritability of these traits determined, and so you can take your linear appraisal scores and you can use those to make management decisions. So how they perform in a show is great, but that is one judge's opinion on one day. And while linear appraisal is subject to that as well, since they are on a linear scale, it seems to be a bit more objective. So they're going to assign your goat a score, and like I said, that should be used to make management decisions. So for example, this was taken straight from the linear appraisal book from ADGA. So you can take a look at this. They assign them letters based on quality, and then their score is calculated based on standard deviations, a lot of math that I'm glad I'm not responsible for. Jen, do you want to jump in and say anything?
I'm happy to answer questions, but I mean, not necessarily need to add anything here. The appraiser also doesn't do all of that standard deviation math. We let the computer scientists make that determination. We're just assigning the numbers. What I will say as far as training, we have about 100 ADGA judges nationwide. There are only 9 appraisers. The training that's required is quite a bit more intensive, and it's annual compared to like a judge's license that's typically renewed every 4 years. So it's safe to say that when you have an appraiser looking at your animals, generally our variation in score is going to be significantly less from one person to another than you might get at a goat show.
Does anybody have any questions so far? Okay. So just like, and you'll find this with milk testing too, if you are thinking you might want to do linear appraisal, you need to plan ahead on that, because applications for the American Dairy Goat Association, those are due before January 31st. So you really need to be thinking ahead so you can get that done. They do sometimes let you turn it in later than that, but of course the fee is higher and it's only if they have room. One thing about, comparing shows to linear appraisal is I can decide to just take my favorite doe who looks exceptional right now to show. But when you do linear appraisal, you're signing up to have every goat in your herd appraised that falls in that breed. So there are some exceptions, such as like if a doe hasn't freshened yet, or beyond a certain age, or if she's been appraised X amount of times. But essentially, if they're on your currently owned list, they're going to be appraised, so you don't get to pick and choose. So this is really a quality indicator for your entire herd and your entire breeding program, which is really, really valuable. If you don't want to be a host herd, or maybe you don't have enough goats to justify that, finding a dairy goat friend that lives close to be a host herd is definitely beneficial. So now my favorite performance program is going to be the Dairy Herd Improvement Program, because it focuses on production. So I raise Nigerian dwarfs, and though they're little, I want them to produce excellent, palatable, rich milk. And the DHI program focuses on that. So I will say from experience, it makes your life easier if you plan ahead. You want to set all of your does to kid near the same time. I this year did not do that, so I have does kidding 4 months apart, so I will be milking until the end of time. You have to milk for a minimum of 240 on most years. There's many plans available. Most people do an owner sampler, which means that you are sending in and conducting your own milk test once a month, and then once out of your X amount of tests, somebody will come and verify that you're doing it correctly. So if this is something you're interested in, and your goats don't have to be registered to do DHI, you can go to the sell barn and do this with her if that's what you want to do and that's what your budget's allowing. This is a great program for everyone that has dairy goats. So the first step would be figuring out which lab you want to use. There's countless labs. Some have really great ratings, some may not be the best fit for you. You need to find one, preferably one where you know someone else who's using it so that you can kind of learn from their paperwork. Then you're going to complete the milk supervisor test. So I test through Langston. So they have a video that you watch on YouTube, and then you use that to complete their supervisor test and you send it in. You also want to make sure that you certify your scales annually. And so at the beginning of the year, I typically send in my supervisor test and my scales, and they send them back to me. And then I'm ready to go when my does freshen. Once you've done that, you can apply with the ADGA, and then you can start conducting your milk test. The paperwork for this is incredibly terrifying when you look at it. It's daunting, and I would guess that it is 90% of the reason people don't finish and get their goats their milk stars. But once you get started, it's really not that bad. So bite the bullet, do it, make mistakes. The folks at your lab will usually call you and you'll fix the mistakes, and it will be okay, I promise. So does anybody have any questions about performance programs? Oh, somehow my slides got out of order. I knew I had missed something. So aside from showing and linear appraisal and milk testing, don't forget that you're breeding these goats for yourself. So above all else, while we are all working to improve our respective breeds, you need to be breeding for goats you're happy with. So for me, I want my goats to have an easy to be around personality. That is number one. If I have a goat that is hard to catch or hard to be around or fights me on the milk stand, she's the first one to get culled. I don't care what she looks like. And for the past, I would think 3 years, I haven't had to milk stand train a single doe at my place. They are first fresheners and they hop up there and they allow me to milk them and I don't get kicked in the face. So what you need to set your own goals, keep track of your own progress, and breed your goats to meet your needs while using these performance programs as a guide. And as you get started, start slow, do not overwhelm yourself, because all of these things can be really daunting. So you have any questions, here is my contact information. I do work for Texas A&M AgriLife Extension as an Ag and Natural Resources agent. I work with our 4-H program, and I also have Wildvine Ranch and Dairy Goats, where we raise paint horses and our sweet little Nigerians. So does anybody have any questions?
I was going to mention, I didn't hear you say, but if you can't commit to 305, there is a 1-day milk test option. And
Yes.
there are some shows that do that along with the show.
Yes,
Yeah.
I can't believe I forgot that. And that has gotten really popular this year. There's actually, I know several breeders that have decided to host their own 1-day milk test because linear appraisal got canceled and there's not a lot of shows. So they're kind of like, why am I milking 15 does twice a day? Let me go ahead and do 1-day milk test and dry them off. So that is also an option. Thank you for mentioning that. Anybody else? Any questions, comments? All right, well, then I'm going to mute myself and turn it over to Miss Jen.
Hi, everyone. Okay, let me get to the share screen option. Give me just a second. Is my PowerPoint visible?
Yes.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, so I joined you guys last time and I said it then and I'll say it again. If at any point you want these slides, please just shoot me a message or shoot Jesse a message after this conference call and I will email you the link to this information. So dairy goat nutrition. This may be a review for a lot of you guys, but not surprisingly, just like cows and sheep, goats have 4 compartments to their digestive system. So this is just an image that shows the 4 sections. So the rumen, the reticulum, so 1, 2, omasum, and abomasum, 3 and 4. So when a baby goat is born, their stomach is a lot like our stomach. It's really designed to digest pretty simple, already broken down foods. The compartment that works is the abomasum, which is that 4th compartment on a grown goat. But the abomasum is what is able to really digest and break down milk. It has a couple of enzymes that help to coagulate, make it clump up, coagulate the milk so that baby goats or baby mammals in general can digest that milk. As the kid begins to nibble hay, grass, things that they find in their pen, the other compartments start to develop as the goat gets older. So at weaning shouldn't occur until a kid is able to consume enough solid foods, things like hay and grain, that they can sustain their body energy needs. And one of the key things to be looking for on those babies is, are they laying down in a corner and ruminating? Are they chewing their cud? However, even then, the rumen isn't fully developed. So one of the things to be aware of is that grain in particular aids with the development of these little hair-like projections called rumen papillae that help to absorb nutrients from the food. So we really want to make sure that goat kids are getting some sort of grain, some sort of carbohydrate in their diet that helps to develop these little projections, these little hairs on the inside of their rumen to give them a long lifespan that aids in like their nutrition throughout their adulthood. Why am I not? There we go. Okay, so when a goat reaches adulthood, certainly by 6 months or so of age, the rumen makes up about 70% of the total volume, whereas before it was 70% was the abomasum. So the functions of the rumen are to digest fiber through microbial digestion. So things like bacteria break down the fiber found in food like hay, and also absorb volatile fatty acids and synthesizes some of the vitamins. This is why if the rumen of a goat suddenly stops working, sometimes they get a really scary disease called goat polio, where their muscles stop working correctly because suddenly the rumen isn't producing enough of the thiamine in it to sustain the goat. 10% of the volume is the reticulum, where further fiber digestion takes place. 8% is the omasum. The omasum's job is really to take water out of the feed stuff and also to absorb water-soluble vitamins. And then 12% is the abomasum, where protein and fat digestion occurs through chemical breakdown. So just like we have, our fruits and our vegetables and our grains and protein sources, animals do too. So 2 types of energy feeds: carbohydrates, so things like oats, corn, barley, rye, things like that. And then fats, which fats have an advantage because they have, for their little tiny package, they contain 2.5 or 2.25 times the energy per unit. But we can't feed like a ton of fat to animals. It's not good for them any more than it's good for us. Examples of sources of energy fats or energy feed fats that we find in goat feeds would include things like cottonseed, canola seeds, safflower, sometimes vegetable oils, things like that. And then, of course, if we're talking about baby goats, we're feeding milk to goat kids, and they get a lot of their fat from the fat in milk. Protein is the key nutrient needed for growth and repair of the body. So it's especially critical for young growing animals, for milking does, particularly at peak lactation, and for pregnant does late in gestation. Proteins can also be synthesized by the rumen bacteria, which is one of the reasons why we want to make sure that that rumen is functioning at its best capability as much of the time as possible. Natural protein sources include things like soybean meal, cottonseed, canola, distiller's grain, and then at least one of our hay sources, which would be alfalfa hay. There are 2 major classes of vitamins. So the fat-soluble vitamins, which are vitamins A, D, E, and then the water-soluble vitamins, so pretty much everything that's in the B complex family, C and K. The water-soluble vitamins can oftentimes be synthesized by rumen bacteria, whereas we have to provide the fat-soluble vitamins in the ration. By the way, the picture of the sheep on here was the only picture I could find of an animal down with polio. Okay, so minerals, hopefully everyone if you have goats, hopefully everyone is already offering some sort of mineral supplement. So macro minerals, minerals that are needed in big amounts, that's what macro means, would be things like salt, calcium, phosphorus. And then there are the micro minerals, which are just needed in small amounts. So things like cobalt and selenium. Copper would fall in there too, because sometimes we talk about copper as being really important to goats. A list of some of the micro minerals. We're not going to go through them, but again, if you'd like access to this presentation, I'm happy to share. Some of the key ones in here. So selenium has a really important function as it relates to fertility. So at breeding season, this can be a big deal. Copper, goats tend to have some issues with getting sufficient quantities of copper in many geographic locations. And then another one that we tend to offer, like an iodized salt block, would be iodine. And then we can't forget water, because even though it doesn't have a nutritional value, an animal's body can't digest all of the feed that is being brought into it without sufficient water. And obviously, if your goat isn't getting enough water, they're not going to be particularly hungry because they're experiencing thirst instead. Plus, it affects lactation. And so the question that I always ask my 4-H and FFA kids is, would you drink from your goat's bucket? Because if the answer is no, you probably need to go clean it out. Okay, quick word about fiber. Fiber is not a nutrient category in and of itself. It actually falls into that whole energy feed category, but adequate fiber is absolutely essential. Particularly, so Jesse talked a little bit about being on milk test. If a milking doe doesn't have enough fiber in her diet, it tends to affect how well her rumen is functioning. And because it affects how well her rumen is functioning, it then makes her lactation information, so like the amount of fat, especially in the milk, kind of cattywampus. So a lack of fiber can lead to depressed milk fat, rumen acidosis, which is where their rumen is just too acidic and it makes them feel sick, and then bloat and other digestive illnesses. Okay, reading a feed tag. I'm going to kind of move through this pretty quickly, but your feed should list ingredients, any recommendations on feeding rate, and if it's a medicated feed, which we don't see nearly as often with FDA regulations, but if there's a medication included, it should say that on the label as well. The other side or further down the tag should list things like protein, fat, fiber, and then a lot of the major minerals that are important to that species. So on goats, we'll typically see something like copper, selenium, as well as maybe some of the other vitamins. Okay, feeding recommendations. So newborn kid to weaning, you'll notice that I have a nice little star up at the top. I'm sorry, Jesse, this is written based off of standard size goats. So I said all quantities listed are appropriate for standard size, adjust appropriately for Nigerians and for minis, because obviously they start smaller. So 48 to 64 ounces of whole milk or high quality, high protein and fat milk replacer. Beginning at 10 to 14 days, offer small quantities of alfalfa hay. If you're in an area of the country where you can't get alfalfa hay, offering a fine stemmed orchard grass or any other hay that's sweet and tender will help to get those kids to start exploring and nibbling at it. And then also offering a kid grain, or if you're in an area where maybe a grain formulation specific for goats isn't available, a calf starter can also work. Gradually increase solid feeds as the kid consumes them. Consider weaning when the kid has at least, I like to say, quadrupled their birth weight. It's a minimum of tripled their birth weight. So quadrupled their birth weight, consuming grain well, showing evidence of laying down, chewing their cud, ruminating. Any questions so far? Okay, so growing kids. We've gotten them to weaning. They're no longer getting milk, but how do we keep them growing well? So free choice, high quality alfalfa for roughage, if at all possible. Again, if you're in an area of the country where alfalfa hay isn't available, if you're down in the southeast, maybe something like a perennial peanut hay. If you're up in the north where they get some really luscious grass hays, you can feed like an orchard grass hay, but something that has a little bit more protein and that high digestibility. Half to 1 pound of 16% protein grain, preferably that's formulated with a coccidiostat. That way you don't have to be managing coccidia separate from your nutrition program. Free choice clean water, free choice salt and minerals, and then monitor body condition, adjusting grain accordingly. If they're starting to get fat, as you might see in like 6 to 10-month-old kids, you might need to cut the grain amount down. Dry yearlings. Dry yearlings can be hard because they tend to get fat a lot easier. Alfalfa grass or forage blend hay feed depending on body condition and also growth rate. As with every other animal, they also need free choice water, free choice salt and minerals. Okay, late gestation does. So these are the does in the last 4 to 6 weeks of pregnancy. At this point, you should start introducing some sort of concentrate, some sort of grain source into their diet. 14 to 16% protein grain. Adjust according to body condition, the age of the doe. So younger growing does, like a doe that's going to kid as a yearling milker or even as a young 2-year-old milker, is going to probably need more grain during late gestation than a 4 or 5-year-old doe might, because not only is she growing kids, her body itself is still growing, like she's still growing. If you know that, like, I use some ultrasound in my herd to determine number of kids that are being carried, If there's a doe who I know is carrying triplets, she might get grain earlier than a doe that is carrying a single. You may consider opting to not grain or only lightly graining does that are carrying a single fetus, just because you don't want the kid to get too terribly huge. And oftentimes these does can maintain the pregnancy, maintain their own condition just fine without that additional supplement of grain. And then, like pretty much all the other goats, free choice hay, water, minerals. Okay, lactating does. And this is a constant, constantly looking at your herd. Do they look like they're in good body condition? Do I need to, when I come outside at 2 o'clock after feeding at 6 in the morning, is all of the hay gone from their bunk? Do I need to provide more? So some of this just comes with experience, but free choice alfalfa or alfalfa forage mix. You could also add in here like a higher test grass hay, a perennial peanut hay. It just really varies from geographic location, what various parts of the country have available. But you want something that has a total digestible nutrients upwards of 50%. Fresh, very clean, free choice water. In many locations, warm water in winter can aid in production. So particularly in northern areas of the country, they'll offer buckets of warm water, particularly right after milking, to help those does, encourage them to drink more water. Free choice salt and minerals, and then 1 pound of grain per 3 pounds of milk produced. And this can be adjusted down for mature does. It may need to be adjusted up for growing yearlings and 2-year-old milkers. Higher fat in that grain mix can help meet energy needs a little bit better than having, so some grain mixes can be as low as like 2.5%. If you get one that is a little bit higher in fat, it helps those, especially those young does or those animals at peak lactation. And then ideally don't use non-protein nitrogen. So something like urea during peak lactation. The goats just don't have enough energy to convert that non-protein nitrogen over to protein that their body can use. Bucks, free choice grain hay, something like oat hay or barley hay or grass hay. Ideally avoid alfalfa products to maintain the calcium phosphorus balance to avoid urinary calculi. 1 to 1.5 pounds of grain during rut to maintain condition. Using a product that contains ammonium chloride can help prevent urinary calculi. That's what the UC is. And then free choice water, of course, really important to help prevent urinary calculi. Salt and minerals. There are some mineral formulations that are specifically for bucks and rams. Questions?
Hey, I have one.
Okay.
I have a buck that I just had my first case of urinary calculi.
I am so sorry.
Well, it was a learning experience. I had changed. I feed primarily a prairie grass hay to everybody, and I was feeding round bales, and I had changed, and it was a highly fertilized round bale, and I think that contributed to it. He was the only one of all my bucks affected, and my does look awesome on this hay. And somebody has told me, well, if you have a highly fertilized hay, that increases that phosphorus. So do you have any input on that?
I don't have personal experience with that. And I mean, I can follow the logic, although I haven't seen any research to suggest that like the highly fertilized hay can contribute. I will also pose that my one experience in 25 years of raising goats was a buck whose sire had also gotten urinary calculi. And so I also, just being genetically minded, always wonder about like genetic components or genetic contributors to something like that. I don't know if Dr. Horner has anything he would want to add as far as like the phosphorus, things like that. But I'm not aware of it, but I certainly don't want to discount it.
Yeah.
From an ag agent perspective, and not to cut off Dr. Horner, but I would recommend sending in a sample of that for a forage analysis from the A&M Forage Lab, just to determine what the phosphorus content is. Of course, when hay is fertilized, it should be done based on a soil test, so that should determine the amount of phosphorus used. However, that's not always what happens, and so it is possible that it does have exceptionally high phosphorus. So that would be something that you could determine with that test.
Yeah, my vet, just to throw this out there, suggested, because there's two types of urinary calculi, and he suggested supplementing, if I continue with this hay, supplementing with alfalfa pellets to help balance that out. Anyway, I just didn't know the validity of that. I'd never heard of that. I was just curious if anybody else had.
So something like ammonium chloride, I would imagine would still assist with prevention of like future calculi issues. So just something to think about.
Thank you. Can I ask another question if no one else is?
By all means.
I have two does that really milk quite a bit right after they freshen, and they get very skinny no matter what I feed them. Do I up their fat on that? I'm afraid I'm going to run into protein inversion. So I'm hesitant to throw more fat at that, but what do you suggest for those type does?
Okay, so my question would be, even though they're losing body condition and are really obviously in a negative energy state, you're not running into a protein fat inversion on milk test?
I have it very slight, if at all, and within a month it corrects itself. And I know I should be doing something before they kid, and I'm just not sure what I need to be doing because I'm feeding them more, knowing that they're going to be doing this.
Yeah, I think there are always some of those animals that are genetically predisposed to trying to milk themselves to death. And yeah, those are just the does that I really want to freshen, where they're pushing a 3.5 body condition, something like that. I don't have the magic solution for those individual animals either.
Thank you. Yeah, at one time I was giving them more black wool sunflower seeds, and that was really tipping that protein inversion. So I was just wondering, I've just kept feeding my usual feed and giving them all they can eat. And
yeah.
Thank you.
Karen, can you explain protein inversion for the folks who are listening that may not be sure what you're talking about? And also, Jen, Aaron H has asked if you can go back to the slide before late gestation does.
I will work on that while Karen explains her thing.
Protein inversion, you really, I don't know how to see it without actually testing for it. And my does typically right when they freshen are pretty close in the protein and fat. But when your protein is a lot different than your fat, you have a protein inversion situation, and you're at a higher risk for acidosis and other nutritional issues. So it's really important to, I learned from Langston, which is where I do milk tests, because you can send your feed and your milk test information up there, and they can give you some recommendations on what you should be feeding. And they suggest that you don't add fat to that. You back off your fat and add long stem roughage to help even out that protein fat ratio. Does that make sense?
Hopefully we didn't lose Jesse. It makes sense to me, Karen, if that helps. So yeah, the fiber is certainly a critical component to getting the milk fat back where it needs to be, keeping the rumen happy. Okay, so Erin, I think that I heard a request. Was this the slide that you were wanting me to show again?
Erin doesn't have a mic, so I'm watching the chat to see some
Thank you.
information. Yes, that is it.
Okay. So of all of the ages to feed, dry yearlings are in many ways the easiest or the lowest maintenance. Other questions?
Yes.
Okay.
Go ahead and explain what we raise. What kind of goats do we raise?
I raise Nigerian dwarf goats and
Okay.
and I show them at the South County Fair, and I do LA.
And we're looking into starting DHI. And so we live in New England. And I was wondering if there might be a suggestion to the best lab that we should use.
There's not really a best or worst. You can just pick one, kind of. I mean, and I know that sounds silly, but they all have positives and negatives. I've only ever used Langston, so I can't speak to other labs, but I've heard people are really happy with, Dairy One and several others. So I think if you choose one, find one that answers questions quickly, because you will have questions, and have very open communication. I think that's important when choosing a lab, especially when you're getting started.
Right. It's very intimidating starting and looking at all of the paperwork, and maybe even a mentor. We just don't really have many dairy goat folks in our area that are into the ADGA performance programs like we're trying to be. So
I'll just, I will chime in with my personal experience with DHI. You're going to want to find a lab that's close to where you are for shipping samples, but where the samples get shipped and the data processor who actually does the number crunching are two separate things. Now, Langston offers both, but for me out in California, I send my samples to a DHI lab that's 45 minutes from my house, but then they send the raw data down to Agritech Analytics. I am not saying that Agritech is the end all be all, but what I will say is Agritech's owner was actually in charge of California DHI for a number of years and has owned a commercial goat dairy. And so if I'm having issues with data, or if I'm trying to figure something out because of his experience, he is super easy to work with. Okay. But as far as the local lab for the analytics side of it, I would imagine if you're in New England, maybe somewhere in New York or Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I think Dairy One in New York. We're in Rhode Island. I think Dairy One in New York is the closest lab to us.
Yeah, there are just advantages as far as shipping samples, not having to ship them as far.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, that makes sense. Thank you.
Can I also make a suggestion?
Yes.
This is going to be a shameless plug for our breed association. I'm the editor of the newsletter for the American Nigerian Dwarf Dairy Association, which is the Nigerian Dwarf Breed Club.
Okay.
And this past year, we ran a series of articles on milk test, how to set it up. We also have a Facebook page where you can ask questions. But I know some of those early newsletters are on our website. So you might want to go there and check that out. And that might give you a basis on where to start.
Okay. Thank you so much, Karen.
You're welcome.
If there are no other questions as far as like my nutrition presentation, I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Were those amounts for the grains for the different age groups of goats, was that the daily amount total?
Yes.
Or, okay.
Total daily amount, typically, of course, split between 2 feedings.
And then for minerals for bucks, we went to an education seminar on nutrition this spring, and the guy said he didn't think or didn't recommend putting minerals out for the bucks because of the urinary caliculi. What brands of minerals are there they're made more for bucks?
So when I'm looking for a mineral supplement for bucks, I'm just looking for something that has a 1-to-1 calcium phosphorus ratio instead of the typical 2-to-1 calcium phosphorus, which is what we usually see for milking does. A lot of the meat goat minerals will run that 1 to 1.5 to 1 on the calcium to phosphorus. So like what I use is actually called Meat Maker mineral for my bucks. And it's just a 1-to-1 calcium phosphorus. My concern, and I'm not saying he's wrong, but my concern is if you're not offering the bucks those minerals, where are they getting the trace or the micro mineral supplementation from?
Yeah, that's what, with our one buck, I feel like he's losing his hair a little bit. And I know it's got to be a mineral issue probably, but I didn't know what to do there.
You know, some other things that I didn't talk about necessarily in the presentation. So anytime that I lose an animal to anything other than like old age, I try to really consciously take a liver sample before I bury that animal or before I dispose of that animal. I'm fortunate because I'm 90 minutes from my state veterinary lab, but I send those liver samples off to get an idea of where my mineral profile is for the herd, which has saved me a lot of grief over the years because like I don't worry about getting too much copper into the ration. I've never had animals up on the high end, whereas I know other people have inadvertently ended up with copper toxicity, things like that. So there are ways to monitor mineral levels, and I would really talk to, almost every state has a veterinary pathology lab that you can work with. But liver samples are by far the best gauge of what the minerals look like in your herd. Excuse me. The other thing is to remember that bucks, as well as the does, so like if you're looking at something like selenium, the bucks need to be if you're in an area that needs selenium supplementation, your bucks need the supplementation just like the does do going into breeding season.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Jesse, I think I should turn it over to you again.
It's actually going to go to Dr. Horner now, so we can both mute ourselves and he can take over.
Awesome.
Let's see, did I come up?
Yes.
Okay. I can't tell anything from here other than I've got my presentation on my screen, so I hope we're good to go.
We can hear you and we can see your presentation, so you're good.
Okay, good deal. So my part today is to talk a little bit about breeding and kidding. And I'm going to kind of not go into a lot of mechanics of this. We want to talk a little bit about some of the goals of breeding. Breeding is one of those things that can be much better addressed as we get more into breeding season. Of course, shameless plug here, we do a really nice AI workshop down here where we spend about 6 hours talking about this kind of stuff. So we can get in a lot more detail later. Here. For the breeding project for 4-H, these breeding projects, to me, this is kind of the capstone of a 4-H career. This is where you put all the pieces together, everything that you've learned your entire time in 4-H about feeding your animals and keeping healthy animals and selection and marketing and all these things go together to make a success story. Anybody can buy a really good market goat and feed it well and show it and win. It's something completely different to have bought that market goat's mother and raised her and made the choices and figured out what you needed to breed her to make that champion offspring, be it a market goat or a dairy goat, and produce that and do it consistently. If you can do that, that says so much more about what you've learned and what you've gained from your 4-H career. That's why I just love 4-H, the breeding project as a 4-H project. I think that's kind of the ultimate thing that we have going for us. When we talk about breeding programs, and the idea is to get future goats that have got the best genetic capability to do what we want them to do. We talked a little bit about that, of course, over the last couple sessions, whether it's selling milk or a type of goat, a show goat, or both, or if it's something as simple as we have a lot of people down here that sell, blue-eyed hairy goats, and that's what the market is, and that's what they want to produce. So they have a breeding program that concentrates on those things that make you some money, that make you happy. And we've talked about that too. You've got to like what you're producing. Whether you're producing production animals or you're producing show animals, we need to go back into our selection of animals, learn what a strong, healthy goat looks like, because that's what we need to start with. Animals that can stand up to the stresses and strains of being production animals, that can work for us, that can live in our environment. Goals of a person's breeding program, it's personal. That depends on each breeder. Everybody has a little bit different goals. What my plans here for the 300 goats that I freshen is a totally different thing that the people that are a half a mile down the road from me with 5 dairy goats for family milk produce as far as their goals. So even though we're in the same location and we breathe the same air and we feed the same feed, our goals are completely different. And they're going to get a lot of different emphasis on the different herds. But one thing that you do have to do is pick a goal and stick to it. If you chase the trends, and I've been around long enough to have seen so many trends come and go, you pay for it at the end. The horrible example, of course, is Nubians, the most popular breed in the nation as far as numbers. People get them because they're cute, and then they trended to spotty goats, and they trended to white goats, and they tended to long ears, and they trended to things that were not necessarily production and commercially viable. And so you wind up with a very broad genetic base, but you wind up with a very poor repeatability, where some of your other breeds that have been selected much more strongly for certain traits will breed much more truly. So changing your goals with the wind really is not a good way to do it. You need to pick what you like, pick what works for you, and through the changes in fashion, keep picking those kind of goats. The other thing is that we don't breed, and we shouldn't be breeding to produce the one perfect goat. Jesse's talked a little bit already about some of these production things. And we want to see our animals, our entire herd, improving over the spectrum of these production goals. We want to see our herd average milk production go up. We want to see our herd average butterfat production go up. We want to see our herd average linear appraisal score go up. If we have problems in our herd, if we know we have a bunch of goats that have got short, steep rumps, we want to see that score from linear appraisal flatten out and get better over the generations. So work on improving your entire herd, not just picking the perfect goat that you're breeding for. Terminology, when we talk about breeding, we can get into a lot of science really, really fast. So we're going to talk a little bit. We're going to start with the estrus cycle, estrus with an O. This is the 20-21 day cycle that the goats go through, and this is just super simplified. As busy as this thing looks, it's nothing compared to what's actually going on inside the animal. That's what we're doing a lot of our research on here, is we're adding spots and specks and text to this thing every year that changes considerably. Things that we can talk about from this that we can take away and use on later is some of the markers that we're looking for that tell us when it's important and when it's time to breed our animal. Some of the things that tell us why things like prostaglandins work or don't work at certain times of the cycle and at certain times of the year. Excuse me. Things like this. Basically, what we want to see in this estrus cycle is the day that she's in heat, estrus with a U. Her progesterone, that's this orange line, is very low. All these other things have already happened, and she's in heat. We'll talk more about this in a little bit later. After she has been in heat, the ovaries start to form a gland on the ovary that actually produces progesterone called the corpus luteum. It takes it 5, 6, 7 days to get up and functioning. Once it's up and functioning, it's going to hold on for another 10 or 11 days. And this is what either keeps her from showing signs of heat or lets her establish her pregnancy. This makes the uterus ready to be pregnant. If she doesn't come in pregnant, then there's some other signals that happen, things that say that, hey, I'm not pregnant. This corpus luteum starts to go away because of other things that have happened, and the whole cycle starts again. So this is the estrus with the O cycle every 21 days, and it's again the basis of all of our synchronization programs and artificial insemination. Everything else is keyed into this program. Estrus with a U, this is what we call heat. This is where the doe is receptive to being bred. Typically, we see these signs of heat, which is something that's really important. If you have a lot of does, it's usually fairly easy to tell because the goats will pretty much tell you when they're coming into heat. We get a lot of increased behavior. We get a lot of walking. We get a lot of pacing up and down the fence. We get calling. We get behaviors where one doe will try to ride the other doe. Usually it's a doe that's being ridden that's in heat, and then there's a dominant doe in the herd that's doing the riding. Usually, not always, but usually. This lasts for about 24 to 36 hours typically, and we see this once every 21 days. So what we have to do is we have to be prepared for this 24-hour period we've got. Once we see this animal starting to come into heat, we have to make these arrangements. We have to know who we're breeding her to. We have to make sure that the boy and the girl are getting together, whether that be she's being boarded someplace, or we have a buck on the premises, or we've got to throw her in the back of a truck and get her someplace, or we're doing artificial insemination and we've got all our pieces together, things like this. We've got to make sure that that's all planned out and in place. Ideally, about 24 hours after we see her starting to act with these signs is the time that we want to get her bred. If we wait much longer than that, it gets to be too late. We've missed that little window of opportunity, and probably 21 days later, again, we're going to see her go through the same thing. Seasonally polyestrous is what a goat is. This just means that through certain seasons of the year, they have several attempts for us to get them bred. Typically with the dairy breeds, most of our dairy breeds are Northern European descent, high latitude, longitude, whichever, gives us an animal that responds very much to the day length. So as the day length increases, she's not going to be responsive. As the day lengths start to decrease, she's going to start to show signs of estrus. This, of course, is just the natural selection for having babies in the spring when there's lots of things to feed them. So the more northern the type of animal is, the tighter that window is. The more equatorial the animal is, whether it's our Spanish goats here in Texas, or the Nigerian dwarves, or the Nubians, the more equatorial goats have a much less of a seasonal effect than we're seeing from a lot of our dairy does. One of the things that we talk about when we're talking about breeding is when we're selecting our sires, we talk about heritability. This is what the sire, the mother and the father contribute to the baby. These are traits that you see measured in a percentage point or a decimal. They give you an idea of how heritable the project is. So if it's high in heritability, above 0.3 or so, that's something that we can affect really fast in our breeding program. So like if you look at this chart where we see stature, the heritability is 0.5, that tells me that if I use a tall buck, I'm going to have tall kids. Whether I use them on a tall doe or a short doe or an intermediate doe, I'm almost always going to have taller kids. If I have a tall doe and a tall buck, then you add both of those traits together and you can almost be guaranteed of a tall kid. You're going to get very few short animals or short statured animals out of 2 long stature goats. The other end of that scale is some of our health and reproduction traits, which are very, very low. That tells us that most of what's going on here is environmental. That's things that we control when we're going back to our nutrition, our management, our environment, has a lot more effect on those. So days to first breeding, yeah, a goat is going to genetically come into puberty, come to a first breeding. Some of it's going to be infected by genetics, but so much of that is affected by our growth program, our feeding program, our parasite control program, the environment. Down here, it's hard for us to see goats come into heat until we get nights that start dropping down into the 60s. We may not get nights that drop down into the 60s until the 1st of October some years down here. So days to first breeding is a very environmental type of trait. Controlling the breeding season. This is where we kind of get into the meat of our breeding program. Again, without talking a lot about the basic mechanics, we need to really plan things way far in advance, and this management wheel kind of shows that. If you come around to 7 o'clock down here, it's saying kidding starting at March 15th. If your March 15th is your projected date that you want to start having babies, you come back around this wheel all the way to August 15th, 8 months earlier is when you're going to start doing your preparation. You've started managing your bucks, you're starting to look at preparing your does, you've made your selections, things like that. 8 months is a long lead time. If you're thinking about having milking goats at Fort Worth, which means you need to freshen them January, the first week of January, we're already inside that 8 months. If you haven't started thinking about it already, you're behind the gun already. So breeding program is something you got to think about way, way in advance. I started making plans for my fall breeding program back in April when we were still in the middle of having a lot of babies being born. And we do a tremendous amount of management here for our animals. And it requires a lot of time to put those things together, but I have specific goals. I have animals that I know I want born for certain shows, so that I have to back up not only the 5 months from the breeding date, but I have to back up 7 months or so before that because I have synchronization and I have sires to line up and semen to buy and things like that. We also have kind of a cutoff date that we don't want kids born after, so we have to limit that breeding season. We've got to be very effective in our heat checking and getting animals bred, things like that. That all comes into controlling your breeding season. Ideally, you're going to have a 40 to 45 day window that lets your doe cycle twice, and it gives you, kind of your target date plus or minus 60 days of when you want to have those babies born. There's some real neat advanced technology when you start talking about breeding dairy goats. Artificial insemination is one that allows us to do a lot. We're able to use bucks that have been deceased for a long time. We're able to get access to bucks that may physically not be available, whether they're living someplace else, things like that. With goats, we're fairly good at that. This is not something you're necessarily going to do as a beginning breeder, but be very, very aware that that technology is out there. And if you've bred successfully a couple years and you're starting to see that, you're just falling in love with those alpines from out in the East Coast and you live on the West Coast, you don't have to buy the animals. That semen's available. You can start bringing those kind of lines in. It also applies when you're trying to manage diseases, things like that. You're able to reduce a lot of issues with animal-to-animal contact. And one of the other things that's really good about using an artificial insemination program is generally you've got so much money into it up front that you're super, super focused on your management. Herds that do a lot of AI tend to be managed much, much better simply because people are more aware of the out-of-pocket cost of getting this stuff done. Embryo transfer is something we don't see nearly enough of in dairy goats. We see it all the time in boar goats down here. It's successful. They've gotten to the point where they're very good at it. We don't see a lot of problems for the donating animal. We see a lot of money changing hands because you've got all these real superior type of animals being born. Again, this is something that I really wish the dairy goat people were using more effectively and more efficiently. So we talk about breeding, and again, without getting into mechanics of it, what happens 5 months later? We have babies. If everything's gone right, we have the little kids. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it. This is something that you want to take up with your vet. You want to take up with the person you bought the goats from. If you're just starting out, this is absolutely the most exciting time of year when these babies are being born. It can also be absolutely the most frightening time of year because there's always potential for things to go horribly wrong. And the unfortunate thing about social media and Facebook and things like that is you hear about the ones that do go horribly wrong. We kid out 300 does a year here, and I have a truly spectacular crash about once every 2 years, and the vet assists with maybe 5% of these births. 95% of the time, mama has a baby, she takes care of it on her own, things go very, very well. Remember that most of the time things do go right. Kidding season, clean, dry, well-ventilated area. We want these babies to get off to the best start possible, and the best start means that they get their colostrum, they're born into a clean environment, they're not attacked by coliforms and things like that that are in the soil or the dirt or dirty bedding or manure pack or things like that. Be prepared to assist the kidding if necessary. Learn what necessary is. If it's your first time kidding, give the doe a chance. If she is going into labor and you see that the signs that she's approaching kidding are coming up, her vulva has loosened up, her tail head ligaments have loosened up, we see her udder has filled up and gotten full, things like that, watch her. When she goes into full-blown labor, which we can see by her laying down, straining, stressing, kicking, don't let that go on for more than about a half hour, but let it go on for that half hour. Don't jump in too soon. Usually, so many times, the goat is working on getting herself positioned, things like that. Things will work out fairly well. Have your mentor on speed dial or your veterinarian if you've got a good veterinarian that's prepared, especially if this is your first few times through it, because it can be kind of frightening. Make sure that you have disinfected things. You want clean towels. You want clean gloves. Absolutely, please use gloves. Arm gloves. Make sure you have medications on hand that are not expired or haven't been sitting out in the sun, things like that. Check the doe's udder for mastitis. We see this, especially with some of our meat goats, where it's kind of hard to get hold of some of them sometimes, and the kids are born and there's nothing there for them to eat. So it's something you do have to check really, really closely. Colostrum, we want to see those kids either getting a bottle or nursing within an hour. We want to feed them somewhere around, again, this is for standard size doe. We want to see eating a cup or so of colostrum within the first few hours of birth. From a CAE negative doe, again, this is going clear back to selection of the animals. Make sure that your animals are CAE negative. If you don't know what this is, we can talk a lot about CAE and disease prevention. If you don't know what it is, you know how important this is. Dip the navels of the kids in iodine. The navels are the fastest way for bacteria to get in the goat's body. I've seen places where if goats are born in not in the cleanest environment possible, people will actually paint the bottoms of their feet also with that same iodine. So that's some of the things you want to do when the kid. Keep your records, take lots of pictures, all this stuff. Again, if you're a 4-H kid, this is going into the record book of successful kidding. Take care of the kids. Again, like going back to your breeding program, make a decision and stick with it. We do things that are not necessarily ideal here. We feed our kids twice a day. We feed them at 8 and about 3. You know, I'd love to be able to feed them 3 or 4 times a day and spread it out. But you know, after the first few days, the kids get up and they get used to it, and that's what works for us, and it works for them. But stick with that. Make sure that it's being done by the same way every time. I have a lot of students. We have farm crew, and we train rigorously to make sure that it doesn't matter who's handling the babies and who's doing what. It's done the same way every time. Dairy goats, disbudding your dairy kids. Again, this is kind of a personal opinion. If you're going to show goats, you're going to have to disbud those doelings and bucklings. If you were doing pack goats and you want to have horns, or you don't believe in disbudding, that's fine too. Just be aware that you're not going to be able to show those goats. Castrating male kids, if they're not going to be kept as a future herd sire or sold specifically through the meat channels. Again, some of these are old recommendations. Be very, very aware of your market. Certain times of the year, you want intact males because they're going to sell for a lot more than castrated males, and you know they're going into the meat chain. Don't overpopulate the world with buck kids. Just because your doe is kind of pretty, it doesn't mean you should keep a buck kid out of her. Again, I freshen 120 to 140 alpines a year, and I typically keep about 2 buck kids because that's the only ones that I think are worth keeping bucks out of. Basic kid care, again, this is a whole nother unit unto itself. Vaccinations for Clostridium and tetanus, I think, is very, very important. Creep feed with a coccidiostat in it, very important. Jen's talked a lot already about feeding up kids. Super critical, again, that those kids get off to a good start. I like to see my kids, again, this is alpines, this is standard size kids, gaining about 10 pounds a month. And for the most part, ours do. And this is where, because we weigh our kids every month, I'm very aware of which kids are doing well and which kids are not. Because I have certain goals for my kids. I want them to gain so much per month. I want them to be at 40 pounds, which is a lot heavier than Jen recommended when I wean them. I want to make sure that they're 80 pounds by the time they're 8 months old so I can get them bred as yearlings. So again, this is how we do our herd here. Okay, I've talked a whole lot. I hope this has all gone through because I don't see any kind of feedback. Is there any questions out there?
I will ask one. I'm asking lots of questions today.
Sure.
How do you, we watched a Lap AI this year, and I would, what's the pros and cons of a Lap AI versus an embryo transfer versus AI? Is that too big of a subject?
No, that's just kind of an interesting way to look at it. Lap AI is everything AI is magnified. The nice thing about Lap AI is it allows you to use less semen, so that, and again, this is a boar people where you're looking at, you know, $1,000 and $5,000 a straw semen, able to split it out amongst 2 or 3 recipients instead of one like you'd use in a normal AI. Your percentage of conception goes up considerably when you're doing lap AI because you're getting the semen exactly in the spot that it needs to be. A good technician has that doe up AI'd and down so fast that you don't hardly realize what's happened to her. So it's not real stressful on the does. A little bit more expensive, but I think that the conception rate, the ability to use marginal semen. I've got some semen in the tank that Jen will appreciate because it's old sodium oaks, it's old things like that that are just not available anymore, and the semen quality isn't very, very good. We've tried using it with transcervical AI a couple times. We had nothing, but we know that there's live cells in there. So that's something we may hold on to and try a lap AI with to bring back some of these 30 and 40-year-old genetics if it's something we really want to play with. Embryo transfer, of course, is really a whole other thing because now you're super ovulating the doe you're going in, you're harvesting all these embryos and you're transferring them out into a bunch of recipient does. Same basic procedure though, you do a lot of things that are very similar. Again, it's a way to propagate the best does. But we do all of our AI here. We do transcervical. We're using some different speculums that we're really kind of excited about. It's improving our conception rate. It's making it a lot easier to do than it has been previously. But we're still doing transcervical AI for the most part. Our boar goats, if we're doing any kind of embryo flushes, so we'll do everything lap AI with them.
So on your AI clinic, when is that? And can we bring our own animals? Do you bring outside animals in, or is
No,
that
we can't
all on yours?
Yeah, we can't bring outside animals in here at all.
Okay.
The biosecurity is pretty tight around here. We try to do it usually about the third weekend in September. And we have a good group of animals synchronized up so that after you spend about 5 hours in the class listening to us talk at you, which really is very interesting because we have 3 or 4 people that are between our veterinarian and our reproductive specialist and our herd manager, you get a lot of information. Then we go out and everybody has 2 or 3 chances to AI a goat with live semen, and we keep track of who did what, and I send out birth notices later if it works out well.
I have a question. When we talk about embryo transfer in dairy goats, I know what the average cost on that would be with a horse. What would the average cost on that be for a producer with a goat?
I don't know. You'd have to contact the technicians directly. Again, I know that the people doing boars, it's more than worth it because their prices are, of course, considerably higher than ours. But to them, it's still worth it economically to be done.
$3,000 to $5,000.
Is it that much?
Yeah, at least here on the West Coast, it is.
And that may be a regional thing too, because we do an awful lot of them locally down here. There's 3 or 4 technicians at least within 150 miles of us that do this in the fall.
Yeah, we have, I think, 3 technicians from Washington to Southern California. So.
Right, that makes a big difference.
Yeah.
And of course, we have available recipients and things like that out of the Spanish goat herds, and all those things go to reducing cost.
We have a question in the chat from Lance. He says, I mix my own grain. How can I add a coccidiostat into the grain and at what ration?
That one you would, again, we buy ours pre-mixed, I'll be honest. Right now I'm using Purina Goat Grower. We can get it from Producers Co-op. We can get the decoquinate feed mixed. I would have to look at a feed tag and see what the percentage is.
Yeah, I was looking at that question as well. And there are some top dress options that might be your best choice because batch mixing can be pretty dicey. Depending on which coccidiostat is being used, like Lasalicid has a narrower margin of safety than the decoquinate does. So I think I would look at top dressing daily rather than trying to mix it into a grain blend, just for safety's sake.
Are there any more questions? Comments, concerns?
I want to thank all of you for putting this together.
Well, I'm just excited at the number of people we have participating, and I'm incredibly grateful to everyone who helped make this happen. If any of you have any questions about how to implement the Dairy Goat Project in your 4-H club, please reach out. I'd love to help you. This is such a great way to foster an interest in our industry and ensure that it will continue for generations to come. Just as we talk about the success the Bourgo industry has, they have that success largely due to the weather goats and the show industry that has developed from that. And while I don't foresee that happening with dairy goats, generating the interest, of course, is good for all dairy goat producers. So like I said, if you have any questions, reach out, and I will be sharing this recording as soon as I get it sent to me tomorrow. So that's all I have for y'all. Thank you.